Hi, this is Dr. James Reade, chiropractic physician and certified functional medicine practitioner. Today we're going to go ahead and discuss fibromyalgia, but we're going to kind of focus in on the symptoms and problems of fibromyalgia more at the level of the spinal cord and also in the brain. So we're going to kind of label this particular video fibromyalgia upstairs. Now, keep in mind that fibromyalgia is not caused by just one singular types of problems or triggers. There's usually a multiple of different things that come into play that can affect the nervous system and some of the other tissues in the spinal cord and in the brain. So we're going to talk about a little bit about the structural changes that take place, some of the functional changes that take place, some of the inflammatory problems, some of the other issues with the blood-brain barrier, hormonal imbalances and so on that can actually influence and affect some of the neurons that are found in the brain and also in the spinal cord that can contribute to the multitude of different types of symptoms that are associated with fibromyalgia. So let's go ahead and explore some of these different issues. All right, so let's go ahead and just kind of summarize fibromyalgia and how it actually manifests itself in the brain and the spinal cord. So keep in mind, with fibromyalgia, you have to think of basically mostly metabolic changes and also inflammatory changes that will actually influence the neurons both in the brain and also in the spinal cord. That seems to be some basic things. Now, with regards to pain, that seems to be a common denominator here with fibromyalgia. There's just increased sensitivity to pain, other types of sensations, cold, heat, just pressure, and so on, lighting, and noise, all seem to be amplified in the nervous system. And of course, that amplification takes place in the neurons in the brain. It's not processed correctly, and we'll discuss some of the different parts of the brain that are involved. And then also there are different nerve tracts that come from the brain that are supposed to calm down and modulate some of these different pain or sensory nerve signals that come from the spinal cord up to the brain. And with fibromyalgia, that normal inhibition or modification is not really taking place. And again, it goes back a lot of times to problems with the metabolism and also with inflammatory changes of these different nerves that are found in the brain and the spinal cord. So regarding fibromyalgia and how it actually influences the brain, there's been a lot of research using functional magnetic resonance imaging or MRIs, and there are varying types of techniques that they utilize in the MRI field and also with PET scans. And they've actually confirmed different parts of the brain that seem to be involved with fibromyalgia upstairs. And also they're finding there's changes in blood flow, which has been definitely confirmed with people that have fibromyalgia. There are also some interesting changes in white matter, which are portions of the axons and other parts of the brain, and also regarding gray matter, which are actually the bodies of the neurons. And they find that there's a decrease in gray matter in certain areas of the brain. And of course, we confirm that, changes in some of the pathways and also some of the chemicals that kind of show up in the brain as well, too, through PET scans. Now, unfortunately, a lot of this imaging is done on a research level. It's not really on a practical diagnostic level that can be used to, diagnose that you do have or confirm that you have fibromyalgia. But let's just put it to say that they have confirmed actual changes in structure, metabolism, and function, and neurotransmitters in the brain using some of these different types of techniques. So through some of these different functional MRI testing and PET scans, they've actually found there are several different areas of the brain that seem to be involved, in particular with fibromyalgia. One of them is actually the thalamus. And the thalamus is an area of the brain that actually receives most of your sensory or pain nerve fibers, from the spinal cord and the rest of the body. And that seems to be kind of the main central system that has to process a lot of these pain nerve signals, and then from there it modulates it and sends it to other parts of the brain. As a matter of fact, there's a nerve tract, it's called the spinal thalamic tract, that is involved with direct connection from the spinal cord right to the thalamus. So that's one of the areas. Another one is actually the hypothalamus. Yes, and it is right next to the thalamus. What is interesting is that the hypothalamus has direct connections to your pituitary gland, which is called the master gland of the body, which actually regulates a lot of your hormones. It affects your thyroid, your adrenal glands, the ovaries, the testes, has an effect on adipose tissue and other metabolic function in the body. So here you have like some of these different signals coming from the thalamus. The thalamus sends signals to the hypothalamus, which can affect your hormonal system and so on. And we call this the HPA axis. So it's the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, HPA. So just an interesting thing to notice. Another area is that the prefrontal cortex, and this is another area that processes pain and sensory signals. It's involved with like short-term memory, the ability to task, also to be able to think about different words or phrases when you're carrying on a conversation. And how many times has somebody with fibromyalgia or neural degeneration for that matter have problems with their speech and collecting their thoughts. So that's another part of the brain that is also involved with fibromyalgia. So another area of the brain that seems to light up and is involved with fibromyalgia is actually the hippocampus. And that's involved very much in memory, learning. It helps to modulate the body's response to stressors. Another area that seems to be involved is the insula. Insula is interesting because it takes a lot of the sensory information and pain information from your body and the outside environment and kind of decides, okay, what's really important here to be passed on, or, I could probably ignore this. Well, the insula in people that have fibromyalgia really are incapable of kind of censoring and trying to figure out, hey, is this really important or is this not really that important? Okay, it seems like all that information just gets passed on and amplified instead. So some other areas of the brain that seem to be involved here with fibromyalgia upstairs has to do with the cingulate. Now, this is an area where you have feelings that are associated with certain sensations and pain. They can become like just unpleasant. It's something to like avoid. It's like, well, every time I, go ahead and bend over here, my back is just so sore and stiff. I just don't want to get up. So it, also affects your motivation, and it can lead to depression or just like sadness as well too. So that's the cingulate. Another interesting area that seems to be involved here is called the amygdala. And you can think of this as kind of like an area where you have a lot of emotions that are attached to different things. Like your emotional center, it causes fear, anger, frustration, anxiousness, a lot of maybe apathy, depression. And it can also result in a loss of sleep as well too. So those are some of the major areas and parts of the brain that are involved here with fibromyalgia. So those are some of the major areas currently that we understand that are involved with fibromyalgia. I'm sure as the research continues on, we'll find some other areas. And it's just interesting how some of these different areas are interlinked and affect one another. So again, fibromyalgia is not just one singular area of the brain. It's different spots in the brain and how it interacts with one another. But again, a lot of these areas of the brain are not operating correctly because there are changes in neurotransmitters. There's changes in inflammation. There's not a removal of proper waste byproducts and so on. So there are a multitude of different things that affect these different areas, and we're going to discuss some of those as well too. So we're going to talk about some of the different neurotransmitters that have been associated with fibromyalgia symptoms and problems. And one of them, okay, probably on the top of the list is serotonin. I think most people are familiar with that. You know, there's just so many SSRI medications, you know, out there. So very interesting. But normally serotonin is involved with actually inhibiting or modulating a lot of sensory and pain nerve signals that get to the brain. Can, you know, suppress it down at the level of the spinal cord. When you don't have it, and in general, when you don't have enough serotonin, this can actually affect your moods. You can have depression, anxiety sometimes, and just an agitation, sleep disturbances, you know, can be involved when you have low serotonin levels. Another neurotransmitter would be norepinephrine. That does some similar things as far as inhibiting pain nerve signals like serotonin does. It also maintains a certain level of alertness, okay, in the body. And generally, people have fibromyalgia. Guess what? The norepinephrine is usually on the lower side. And of course, there are a plethora of different medications that seem to alter serotonin and norepinephrine as well too. So the next one would be actually dopamine. And there's been controversy, you know, in some cases it seems to be too high, in some cases it seems to be too low. And I'm sure that all depends upon the person's biochemical individuality and their genetics and so on. But again, it can affect fibromyalgia because it affects muscle movement. It can affect your motivation. It can affect whether you feel rewarded about things or satisfied. So, you know, having proper dopamine levels can be associated with problems with fibromyalgia. Another interesting one is glutamate, okay? And glutamate, most people have not heard about, but glutamate is actually a neurotransmitter. It actually acts, it stimulates things. It's an excitatory neurotransmitter. So it overexcites a lot of different neurons. Unfortunately, that leads to some inflammatory changes in the neurons itself, metabolic issues. It will interfere with the proper inhibition and processing of pain and sensory, you know, nerve signaling. It also can, you know, lead to actually damage to the neurons over time, and they can actually, some of them actually can die, and it leads to definitely surrounding neural inflammation as well. So it can have an influence in microglial cells, and we'll get into that in just a little bit. But again, glutamate is not a good thing. So just as a small example, monosodium glutamate, all right, that MSG. This is why a lot of people get this anxiousness and abnormal, you know, responses, you know, when they are exposed to MSG. So if you don't have the right metabolism, you don't have the right cofactors and vitamins and so on to break that down, glutamate can be a big problem if you have fibromyalgia. Another one is called substance P, and they find that that's generally elevated at the level of the spinal cord and the brain, and it increases just pain sensitivity. So that's another one. GABA, okay, gamma aminobutyric acid, all right. Generally, that's an inhibitory type of neurotransmitter. So it helps to like calm things down. Again, this is one that's being researched. They're not quite sure if it's too high in certain individuals or certain areas or too low. So, but that's active research going on. But I wanted to go ahead and mention that because it is a major inhibitory type of neurotransmitter. And so it's important to go ahead and mention at this point. One other is actually melatonin. Now, most people say, oh, isn't that for sleep? Well, melatonin does so much more than just sleep, okay? It is an important neurotransmitter that it has antioxidant properties to it. You know, during the night when you produce more melatonin, or normally should produce that, but people who have fibromyalgia do not, and they have issues with that. that it helps in the restoration, of the neurons. It actually decreases inflammation. It can affect the mitochondria, all right? And mitochondria are important, particularly with nerve cells, because they have a high amount of mitochondria in them. And so it also affects actually CoQ10 levels, which is an antioxidant and is important for proper function of the mitochondria. So melatonin, yeah, okay. It's better to go ahead and get your body to produce it itself rather than relying on a supplement. So there are different kinds of nutrients that are involved with producing proper levels of melatonin. But we'll save that for some other video, but just let you know that there can be things that can be done for melatonin. So, hey, melatonin is something that's ignored a lot of times in regards to looking at fibromyalgia. Okay, one of the things too that most people complain about if they have fibromyalgia is that they're always fatigued, okay? They have no energy, no motivation, don't want to do nothing, all right, if they don't have to. So what seems to be going on? Well, there seems to be a very, very strong link with fibromyalgia and dysfunction of the mitochondria. And why are the mitochondria important? Well, they produce an energy molecule in your cell called ATP. And without adequate levels of ATP, your neurons are not going to function correctly. And for that matter, a lot of other your cells in your body are not going to, and organs are not going to function correctly as well. So the mitochondria, interestingly enough, are actually concentrated in highly metabolic tissues. One of which is, guess what? The neurons in your brain, your spinal cord, and in your periphery, okay? So yeah, your nerves require a lot of ATP. And what's interesting, what feeds, the mitochondria are proper, blood sugar levels, which is actually glucose. So people have hypoglycemia, hyperglycemia, or diabetes, or insulin resistance. Yeah, most of those people also will have fibromyalgia, okay? Or I should say that most people who have fibromyalgia have these problems. And of course, how common it does it seem to be these days with having insulin resistance and, the rates of diabetes just going up. So addressing this key metabolic dysfunction is very important if you're going to go ahead and help to resolve fibromyalgia issues. So, and also you have to have the right types of antioxidants for proper mitochondrial function. So it's like your B vitamins, your vitamin C, CoQ10, all right, or just like some small examples that are important for proper mitochondrial function and help to resolve, some of the metabolic dysfunction that's taking place with your mitochondria within your brain and spinal cord. So here's another thing that can be involved here with fibromyalgia upstairs, okay? It has to do with the microglial cells. Now, what are those? Well, what's interesting is that there's actually in the brain, the microglial cells are a specialized type of cell. And there's actually 10 microglial cells to every one regular neuron in your brain, which is very, very interesting. Now, normally the microglial cells help to maintain the environment and homeostasis, in the brain and spinal cord and all the surrounding neurons, okay? But what can happen is that sometimes there are certain triggers that can cause these microglial cells that are in a nice balanced state, we call them M1, can be converted into these M2 microglial cells that produce many, many different kinds of inflammatory cytokines, chemokines, and so on. And their purpose is try to bring down inflammation, but at the same time, they can get out of control. So it's almost like you have the mild-mannered, Dr. Bruce Banner suddenly becomes the Hulk, okay, in your brain. All right, that might be somewhat of an exaggerated type of analogy, but you get the idea here that, the microglial cells have become unglued, okay, and they are overreacting to different things. So what can cause this, Bruce Banner to Hulk thing, or the M1 to the M2 type of change in the microglial cells? Well, one could be like physical trauma, all right, or damage, to the neurons, the blood vessels, the dural membranes, which we will talk about a little bit later here, in the brain and spinal cord, that can actually begin to kind of trigger some of these, changes in the microglial cells. And of course, how does this damage occur? How about automobile accidents? All right. How about sports injuries? Falls. All right. Okay. All these things are, even direct trauma to the head can begin to, cause some of these different changes in the brain and the microglial cells. So a lot of times with, trauma, it's important to begin to use, different types of enzymes and so on to try to bring down that initial acute inflammation. Just kind of a side note here. But what are some of the other triggers that can cause this M1, M2 change, Bruce Banner to Hulk? Well, it has to do with actually your gut, all right? You can have some different types of inflammatory endotoxins that might come from an overgrowth of negative, gram-negative bacteria in your gut. And they produce what they call lipopolysaccharides. And we have a whole, series about lipopolysaccharides, how it actually affects joints, but they can also affect neurons too and cause inflammation. Another one could be like mycotoxins that come from the overgrowth of yeast in your gut. It could be from other kinds of bacterium, other microorganisms, maybe parasites that, some of their metabolic byproducts and so on can actually impact and cause inflammation, in the brain and affect those microglial cells. How about just toxins and pollutants that we get exposed to, like in our foods, our different preservatives and dyes and so on and so forth? How about what's in our water, the air, personal hygiene products, all right, that we put on our skin, maybe some other chemicals that we come in contact with, different petroleum byproducts, heavy metals, pesticides that we get exposed to. There's just a multitude of different things that we get exposed to these days. And I do have some newsletters that kind of address, toxicity and, what are some of the things you might be able to go ahead and do. So again, that's another trigger here that can, affect the microglial cells. And we don't really think of that as being involved with fibromyalgia, but guess what? It may be a component. How about chronic mental emotional stressors? This can release over time a chronic stress response, which then impacts, the adrenal glands, the thyroid. It can affect some of the other hormones, estrogen, testosterone, and many others. And keep in mind that your neurons, all right, do have little receptors that respond to estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, and they respond to the thyroid hormones, cortisol, stress hormone. So keep that in mind here, all right? That's very important that this can also play a part in fibromyalgia. How old are people, a lot of times people realize that stressors, all right, can be one of the things that triggered their fibromyalgia, okay? So these are some of the different triggers here that can affect the microglial, which affect inflammation, affects neuronal, activity in the brain. Let's take a look at another factor that may come into play with fibromyalgia. And you begin to get the idea there are many different things. Well, that's right. That's why we're doing this video. But the blood-brain barrier, okay, this is kind of interesting, is that normally it should be a very selective type of barrier. It's formed by, obviously, this, small little capillaries. They have what they call tight junctions surrounding it, or actually what they call astrocytes, which are a different kind of neuron. So it has like an extra kind of protection, for some of the neurons. But again, what can happen is that sometimes when this blood-brain barrier becomes compromised, and again, it can be a multitude of things. Actually, we mentioned a few, like trauma, for example. That can begin to compromise it, or other chemicals. There's also kind of an interesting thing here too. We're going to kind of meld this in here with the leaky gut, because that can be another issue that can actually affect the blood-brain barrier. So a lot of times you have this access of the gut and the brain, and we find that a lot of times if you actually have a excessive permeable gut or a leaky gut, that can actually affect the blood-brain barrier. And if you don't have that normal barrier, a lot of other chemicals and compounds can pass through the walls of the blood-brain barrier, get into the brain and affect the microglial cells, all right, or have a direct effect on neuron activity and cause, an inflammatory process that takes place. Now, one of the things that they suspect that goes on here is that you have the enteric, what they call nervous system, and immune system embedded in your gut. And you also have your vagal nerve, all right? And you've got two, okay? Not vagus, but vagal nerves, all right? And 80% of that is actually sensory. And the vagal nerve actually has an intimate connection with the gut and sends all the sensory information into the brainstem and is distributed into other parts of the brain. And the vagal nerve can distribute that sensory information, and that can begin to cause, changes in the blood-brain barrier, some of the functioning, okay, of some of the neurons. You also want to make sure that that vagal nerve is functioning correctly, because it is one of the major, what they call parasympathetic nerves, and they actually calm things down. Generally, people who have fibromyalgia, guess what? Their sympathetic nervous system, their accelerator pedal is down to the floor here and is never given a rest. And that can cause that chronic stress response that we mentioned earlier. So, making sure you have proper vagal nerve activity would be, actually good. And there are certain exercises that kind of questionable how effective they actually are. But, meditation, cognitive types of mindfulness and so on can have some, benefit. I know they're doing more and more research. There's some electrical types of stimulus that can be done for the vagal nerve that could probably help with that. And of course, we'll talk about the leaky gut. There's just so much that goes on with that. We have, separate videos and newsletters about just the leaky gut and trying to get that under control, getting the microbiome, okay, because those are the bacteria that, primarily bacteria that actually line the gut and interact with the nerves and the immune system in your gut. And again, that can, have your gut-brain axis. So getting your bacterial content and microbiome balance is important. And there are different tests, stool tests that we can do here at our office that do take a look at that microbiome and take a look at some of the functioning of your gut. So there's that leaky gut, leaky brain, blood-brain barrier that can be involved here with fibromyalgia issues. So one other thing that is coming to light here with more recent research that might be involved here with fibromyalgia is actually the glycolymphatic system. Now, what they're finding is that this particular system involves your cerebral spinal fluid and also fluid that, actually bathes all the different neurons and so on, and has, some of your arteries and veins and special, almost like vessels that kind of guide the movement of some of the actually cerebral spinal fluid throughout the brain. And a lot of this is, they're finding that through functional MRIs, they've kind of discovered more of this type of this particular type of system and how important it is, especially at night. And it does seem to be kind of have like a pulsate type of activity. It may, it's correlated with respiration, even with blood flow. And just to kind of digress just a bit here, I know with doing different types of cranial work and osteopathy, they did find many years ago that there seemed to be like this rhythmic flow of cerebral spinal fluid. So I think they're beginning to take a look at this a little bit more seriously and finding that these things might be tied in, and that there may actually be some connection between the cranial movement and some of the different dural membranes that are found in the brain area and pumping the cerebral spinal fluid through the brain. And what happens, it helps to remove waste material, metabolic byproducts from the nerves and so on. and they're finding it's very active at night. And there may be some connection with that and the inability to remove beta amyloids and tau proteins in the brain that have been associated with neural degeneration, such as Alzheimer's. So some similar mechanisms may be going on here with fibromyalgia. This is an area of active research that they're doing right now. They're also finding that this glycolymphatic system might help to push nutrients, different lipids, or fats, and other types of compounds throughout the brain as well too. So basically, it's like, yeah, you have to have that proper circulation, not only blood circulation, all right, which they found, but there seems to be something going on with cerebral spinal fluid as well too. So very, very interesting research and some tie-ins, possibly with fibromyalgia. Here's another thing, all right, that probably doesn't get a lot of attention and so on, or even thought about it, but I'm a chiropractor, and of course, as a chiropractic physician, we always think of structural things. And I know we've kind of alluded to, changes in blood flow in the brain, and we mentioned about the cerebral spinal fluid flow and how that might impact the functioning of the brain and spinal cord. Well, this is kind of interesting. There is a membrane that surrounds your spinal cord. It's called the meninges. And then when it gets into the skull, it lines the brain. It's called the dura. It attaches to the bones of the skull. So the idea is this, is that the attachments, okay, of the dura to the bones of the skull and to the base of the skull, what's interesting is that once it exits the base of the skull, this membrane is actually called the meninges. So the dura and the meninges really are kind of like a continuation of one another. But the meninges, what's important to know is actually attached to the upper 2 to 3 vertebrae in your neck. It also attaches to the tailbone and another bone in your lower back, the sacrum. So you can imagine me holding this imaginary rubber band represents the meninges and the dura. These are the attachments to the lower back. These are the attachments to the head and the neck. And you twist one end of this, you get twisting along that membrane. Now, what's interesting, you can think of my torso as the spinal cord, and my arms here are the nerves. My shirt here would actually be the meninges. It coats the spinal cord. It also sends a little sleeve along these nerves. And what is interesting, when you get this twisting, it can cause pressure changes, okay, within the spinal cord and the brain. They're finding there seems to be some research showing like low levels and changes of intracranial pressure that might also affect some of nerve function and so on. And I'm going to elaborate a little bit more about that in the newsletter associated with this video. But misalignments of the upper neck, maybe down here in the lower back, particularly the base of the skull, and even, yes, some of the bones of the skull, made it actually influence blood flow, may influence cerebral spinal fluid flow, change some of the pressure as well too, and some of the neural firing and muscular firing that can give feedback to the brain here, and may be another component of fibromyalgia. Like I said, a component, and I'm not saying that is exclusively, but it's ignored. And, of course, I'm a chiropractor, so I take a look and think about how the structure of the body can affect function. And there seems to be a lot of anatomical overlays here that can affect the function, of the brain and the spinal cord. So another thing to actually consider. Another thing to consider is somebody's genetics. Why would one person develop fibromyalgia, another would not? This is not to say that that's the only reason, people develop fibromyalgia and others do not, but it's another consideration. There are different types of genes that have been associated with varying components of what we've mentioned already that can be triggers of fibromyalgia. One could actually be there's certain genes that affect the mitochondrial function, all right, and how well you produce ATP. There are some other genes that are involved with the production of glutathione, which is the main anti-inflammatory antioxidant. And again, you know, glutathione is so important for reducing inflammation. And guess what? Fibromyalgia is involved with inflammation. We also, there could be some other genes that are involved with proper detoxification. So if you're not breaking down things properly, maybe some of these endotoxins we had mentioned about, that can be another issue that can lead to fibromyalgia. Maybe you're not breaking down some of the things you're exposed to in your food, air, and water. This is why certain pollutants might affect one person, particularly somebody who has fibromyalgia versus someone else who has, very good detoxification systems that are not genetically connected. Also neurotransmitters, we mentioned that already. And of course, that's under genetic influence and control. I'm going to mention methylation, which is like a big thing here. There are different genes that affect methylation. They affect actually the production of energy in the body as well too. So yes, genetic profiling would be important, and we are offering some of that here at our office, and we can download some of your genetic profiling, and there you can actually go ahead and do some testing to begin to figure out and break down your biochemistry and see, maybe you need more vitamin B6. Maybe you need more of these antioxidants to make up for your poor detoxification genes that you have. You may have to take methylated forms of B12 and folate to make sure you have proper methylation, as a small example. So we are doing some of this testing here in our office, and that can be another component here that might help to answer and resolve some of these problems with fibromyalgia. And since we were talking a little bit about genetics and inflammation, one other last thing I want to mention too is that they're suspecting that fibromyalgia may have an autoimmune component. They did a very interesting experiment where they had somebody who had, they took immunoglobulins or antibodies from a normal person and put them in a mouse. And then they took actually the antibodies from somebody who had fibromyalgia and put them in a mouse. And they found this, I don't know why they did that, but anyhow, very interesting experiment nonetheless, all right? They found that the antibodies from the healthy person did not affect the mouse. But the antibodies from the person who had fibromyalgia seemed to affect the mice, and they started coming down with joint problems and pain syndromes and other types of things. So just a kind of a very interesting thing. So there may be some, they're trying to do more research here to see if there might be some autoimmune components to fibromyalgia. Okay, so I know we presented a lot of bits of information and so on, and different triggers and other things that seem to be involved here with fibromyalgia. I just want to let you know, it's not just take this pill or take that pill, all right? And of course, I know some of you that already have fibromyalgia have probably been through all this, okay? You take this pill for that, this pill for this, I know they're, looking at different ways of trying to address this, but personally, I don't think there's going to be really one pill that's going to help to resolve some of this, but yeah, some of these medication might give you some relief, but again, it's all about trying to look at underlying, issues and root causes of things. And, trying to address like the microbiome, all right? Trying to balance that out, get rid of the leaky gut. So we have, videos and information about some specific things to, do about that. Avoiding maybe running a profile to see if you have any food sensitivities, which can affect the leaky gut and cause that gut-brain thing. So that can also, be done as well too to help to resolve that. I'm just going to mention like nightshades, for example. They find that those can cause a lot of joint problems and so on. So it might be a matter of, hey, you have to eliminate tomatoes, potatoes, and peppers, and that might, help to give you a considerable amount of relief. So just, food for thought. And we also, go ahead and, doing the proper testing to try to figure things out, maybe doing the GI map test to find out what's going on with your microbiome would be appropriate. Taking a look to see what your levels of antioxidants are, because again, those are important and crucial to help to balance and decrease inflammation. So doing like a micronutrient test would be a good approach to some of this. You may also have to take a look at the hormone levels. Do you have a chronic, stress response? So doing a salivary test to take a look at cortisol and some of these other hormones, or doing the blood test to check just your general levels of, your thyroid, to take a look at estrogen and progesterone and testosterone levels. That might be another clue to addressing fibromyalgia issues. Doing kind of like some little genetic testing to see what you're predisposed to. Maybe you need certain extra cofactors or other things. Maybe you have a methylation issue that needs to be resolved because it affects neurotransmitters, it affects inflammation, it affects glutathione, and energy production in the body. Make sure you have proper mitochondrial function. So, doing some, blood work can begin to kind of infer that you have, some issues here with the mitochondria. So there are so many different things that can be utilized, and, get your diet straight. So one of the recommendations I would say is something that's very basic. Go to my website, look at the anti-inflammatory diet. It just gives you some basic guidelines. You have to clean your diet up, get rid of all the junk, that's found in your pantry and your refrigerator that could be, leading to some of these fibromyalgia problems, okay, that you've been putting up with. So these are all these different types of considerations. We find that low-level laser might help to reset, some things here in the brain and spinal cord and help with, better functioning of some of the neurons, or help with other aspects of your health. Acupuncture, of course, can help to alter physiology as well too. We mentioned about the chiropractic could be some things, especially the upper neck area or the lower back, doing some cranial work, having a masseuse work on maybe some of those areas as well too, would be of great help to you. So I just want to kind of give you hope that there are other things that can actually be done naturally, not to just say, well, I guess I'm doomed to just take this particular pill forever and I got to learn to live with it. Of course, mindful techniques. Okay, those are some other things. Doing the right kind of exercising, all right, is another thing. Getting proper sleep. But again, we cover some of those things in some of our prior, videos and also newsletters. So if you want to look more about mitochondria, leaky gut, okay, also some other things about fibromyalgia, I would encourage you to go ahead and go to our website, take a look at our videos and take a look at some of our other newsletters. And it's actually, AZ, Family Health Center, CENTER.com. And if you really want to delve into some of this and see if that, hey, Dr. Reade, is there something that you can do for me to try to figure out what is going on with my body? Why do I have all these fibromyalgia, issues? I'd be happy to go ahead and see what we can do and do a proper evaluation. And in order to do that, call my office at 480-732-0911. And one of my staff members will be happy to go ahead and assist you, and we'll see what we can actually do. I hope all this information was good, and I hope it wasn't overwhelming, and I hope at least it gives you some hope that there can be some other things that can be done if you're suffering from fibromyalgia. So once again, thanks for watching.